Good evening. Welcome to the International Spy Museum. I'm Amanda Olke, Adult Education Director here, and I am really excited to greet you. This is our very last public program for adults in this building here at the Spy Museum, and we've got a really cool event to wrap things up. We'll be back at doing cool programs and exhibits in our new museum, but this is a fantastic inclusion. We're going to be here for Spies of the Soviet Silver Screen. And we'll be exploring two Soviet pop culture tales, both from 1973. Now, here at the Spy Museum, we really like to draw connections between fictional spies and the real world. And you may know that we've extensively studied the villains in James Bond in our Exquisitely Evil exhibition, which is still on display. Now, in 1973, Bond was being played by Roger Moore, and he was tangling with a drug lord dictator, soul food entrepreneur who also dabbled a lot in voodoo. It's really one of my favorites, Live and Let Die. Well, what were the Soviet counterparts to James Bond and Live and Let Die doing at that time? Our speakers tonight will give us a look at the origins and influences of two very popular Soviet pieces from that time. I'm going to introduce both speakers, and they will speak consecutively, and we'll do Q&A at the end. But our first speaker is Eric Jens. He'll be discussing 17 Moments of Spring. Eric is a former Army sergeant, a Russian linguist, and intelligence officer. He's a graduate of the University of California, Los Angeles, and the University of Michigan Law School, and since 2008 has served on the faculty of the National Intelligence University, where he teaches national security law, intelligence ethics, collection and analysis, and other intelligence topics. Tonight's talk is based on an article Mr. Jens wrote in 2017 for the CIA's in-house journal, Studies in Intelligence, which I read and then immediately got a hold of him and said, please, I want to hear more. His comments tonight are his own and do not necessarily reflect the assessments or positions of any branch of the U.S. government. Feels like a disclaimer to me. Okay. Our second speaker, my colleague Shauna Oltmans, will discuss The Plainclothesman, which is based on the real-life spy Dmitry Bistro-Lyotov. Ms. Oltmans is a fellow member of the exhibition team for the new Spy Museum at L'Enfant Plaza, which I mentioned previously. She has especially worked on an exhibit devoted to Bistro-Lyotov, and he will be one of the first spies the guests will meet at the new museum. She has a master's in museum studies from George Washington University. Her undergraduate studies focused on American history, and the views that she presents tonight do not necessarily, not really. Anyway, you guys are in for a really interesting night. Thank you both for being here.
Good evening, all. Thank you for coming. When you're the one speaking, your time is gold, time stands still, so I just like to keep myself honest here. Okay, so I married a Russian, and I kept on clearance. It can happen to you. More accurately, she was Australian when I met her, but born and bred in Russia. So a couple years into our marriage, at great trouble, she found this figurine and gave it to me at Christmas and said, "It's Sturlitz." And I said, "Wholitz?" And she said, "All my relatives are calling you Sturlitz because they know that I'm marrying somebody who's an intelligence person, and they're all calling you Sturlitz." That's her nickname. Who, what, huh? But so I had just been able to watch Band of Brothers, and so in return, I watched 17 Moments of Spring with Olga, and it's 12 episodes made for Soviet television in the early 70s. And no one's heard of it. I hadn't heard of it. None of my fellow linguists or Russian specialists had heard of it. Some knew it existed, but had never seen it. And so I looked more into it, and one of the first things I found was a CIA report declassified a few years ago. In 1969, CIA filed a report to the effect that there had been a Soviet officer in the Nazi hierarchy during World War II who was working undercover to scuttle the American peace talks with Germany being held behind Russia's back. And this is uncorroborated intelligence to be filed accordingly. Well, what that analyst described was the plot of this fictional miniseries, 17 Moments of Spring. And so a rough parallel would be if we found an old Kremlin file that said, the Americans have built a spaceship and we think they're going on a 5-year mission, uncorroborated, but we'll keep following this. That's how opaque Soviet culture was to the Americans, even those who were supposed to be tracking it. And as the question of why do we care about this 40-year-old TV show from the old Soviet Union, it has very real relevance and had a very real effect on the trajectory not only of Russian politics, but world politics as well, as I hope to convince you. So Stirlitz occupies around the same cultural space in the old Soviet Union and the current Russia as sort of a combination of James Bond, Spock, and Atticus Finch. I'm sure you recognize at least one or two of those names. Somebody who's ubiquitous, who's played by a beloved actor, who's known for that role and no other almost, who has their own theme music, and who's just an exemplar of a certain kind of handsome, charismatic, protective, but romantically unavailable figure that everyone loves sort of from a distance. And so I'll show you some clips a little bit later to get a feeling, if you can get a feeling from 15 minutes out of a 16-hour miniseries filmed at the Russian tempo of what we're talking about here. So I'll start off with a little bit of background about Russian cultural attitudes towards intelligence generally, and why it really wasn't a thing in Russian culture to be into espionage as a fictional genre. Leaving aside a lot of really great intelligence in the 19th century that we don't have time for, the French Dreyfus affair was probably the first global intelligence scandal. Those of you who haven't heard of it, aren't familiar, Dreyfus was a Jewish army officer, artillery officer, who was set up for treason by some French intelligence types. And he went to Devil's Island for a number of years before he was exonerated. And it was a complete frame-up by these evil intelligence officers. And it made global headlines. People followed it like the serial of the week. What's going on? Oh my God, breaking news. They, forged documents. It was made for fiction. But for one thing, it cemented the image in European culture, because France was a driver of both Russian and European culture, that intelligence was inherently distrustful and the kinds of people who did it amoral. If you go back a century to James Fenimore Cooper's The Spy in American literature, that book is full of apologies for the spy, that even though he's a spy, he's still as honorable as a soldier. This sort of defensiveness that you can be honorable even if you're a spy, but it's difficult. So this early on sort of set up espionage in Russian culture as well as something that really was not to be admired. Now in the West, we had Lawrence of Arabia. T.E. Lawrence was not the first political intelligence officer to operate in languages and native garb. Probably the first one to get himself photographed in a studio wearing the native garb, in a wind tunnel to make great photographs back in England as Lawrence of Arabia. He really set up this glamorous image of the intelligence business. And he was actually following in the footsteps of Rudyard Kipling's Kim, which is a great saga, obviously, of the great game of espionage in Afghanistan and India. And in fact, Kipling, I believe Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence met Kipling and was inspired largely by that book to get into the business. So over and over you see fictional spies inspiring real people, up to and including Putin, who we'll get into later, to get into the intel business. So this, and then there's a whole tradition during World War I in England, of these spy novels that were Jeremiads against the evil Germans. But still they were spy fiction and people ate them up. Fast forward to World War II, the Allies ran a globe-hopping intelligence war around the globe, right? There was the Pacific Theater, breaking Japanese codes, getting to Midway first with the most because we broke their codes, they couldn't break ours. Breaking the German Enigma cipher, and then doubling the whole German network back on itself because we could read their messages and they never knew it. And then Wild Bill Donovan and his OSS throat cutters traveling the world. All these great stories that really laid the groundwork for Bond and others like him that were rooted in World War II experience, or at least pitched that way. Now, on the Russian side, the Russians were not globetrotting. They were trying to keep the dang Germans out for the entire war, and their adventures all took place pretty much inside Soviet territory. And both because the early NKVD and KGB did not glamorize individual intelligence officers, and because there just weren't that many stories of daring do to start with compared to what was going on in the West, the ground was not fertile, literally speaking, for this kind of fiction to take root. Now, there are other obstacles on the Russian side to anybody who wanted to write stories about dashing intelligence officers. Intelligence in the Soviet mind of the 40s meant memories of Stalin's purges, the terrors, secret murder by night, all these terrible things that went on in the 30s, of which the intelligence people were the visible face. So that led to a narrative problem, which is that if you were a Russian author trying to write about a heroic spy in the 1950s or 60s, you had to account for them and make sure that the audience wouldn't say, yeah, they're so seasoned, what were they doing in the 30s, right? So one way around it was to have the protagonist, there's a film, Ошибка Rezidentia. I mutilated it, thank you, sweetie. Olga's going to back checking my pronunciation. About a NATO officer who sees a light and defects to the Communist Party. Or you would have movies about scout patrol units during the Great Patriotic War, where it was more of a military operation that happened to be scouting as opposed to a lone clandestine operator doing sneaky stuff. There was a doctrinal problem on the Soviet side, which is that the motherland's defense forces were only for defense, right? Soviet Union could never be aggressive, but espionage by its nature is aggressive. You go to other people's countries and sneak around there and maybe break things. So it meant that the closest they could get were perhaps counterintelligence stories within the Soviet Union. So you have all these narrative obstacles. And I will note that for a counterfactual, there was one Soviet intelligence officer in World War II. His name was Koklov. Koklov had a life ripped straight from fiction. He started his career training with a vaudeville group to go around and assassinate Germans in occupied Russia while masquerading as a vaudeville group. And how James Bond is that, for starters? Then later on, he became an assassin for the KGB, and a film was made about him in 1947, Podvig Razvedchika, Feats of a Scout, where he actually is, he parachutes into Berlin in a German uniform, sneaks around, captures a general, things that he pretty much did. In fact, he did parachute into Belarus during the war in Nazi uniform, killed a Nazi general, and was extracted. So great stories. So he made a movie about him in 1947, pretty much documentary sort of realism. Really popular movie, made everybody famous. 2 years later, Koklov defects to the West, to the embarrassment, at least, of the people who had talked Stalin into making this film about him. So that kind of chilled any further developments for clandestine civilian officers for a few years to come. And by the way, after his defection, Koklov would survive the first actual polonium poisoning attempt. Some of you are familiar with Litvinenko, who was killed by polonium in Europe, in England a few years ago. The KGB did the same thing to Koklov, but they weren't as good at it then. He survived. He died. He ended up being an academic in California. And his story actually highlights a challenge of any talk on intelligence. There are so many fascinating tangents. So I hope in a new location I can come back and talk about Koklov next year. So, drop something in the suggestion box. Okay, so anyway, so Russian fiction starts off with these handicaps, the baggage of the terror, Soviet doctrine. Meantime, Ian Fleming, bless his heart, starts turning out these Bond novels in the late 50s, and they were popular, but in, I think, 1962, Dr. No comes out, and that launches Bond into the global stratosphere. And the Kremlin had a problem. They could and did have Bond criticized in Pravda as a villain who thought, quote, rape was valor and murder a funny trick, which is not unfair, especially for the early Bond films. He was an objectively terrible person in the early films. But still, he was charismatic, played by Sean Connery, for God's sakes, and the Soviets had no counter to counter this propaganda image of a heroic spy. So Andropov comes to head the KGB. And he decides he wants to rehabilitate the image of the KGB and of intelligence generally, make it heroic again. So he has his people look around for an author who could start write a character to counter Bond. So the first attempt was a gentleman named Gulyashki, a Bulgarian, who was sent to England to talk to the late Ian Fleming's publishers to ask about continuing using the Bond character for his own novels. The publishers said, not only no, but heck no. And then under British copyright law, the copyright was at risk if they just sat on the copyright. So they immediately went out and found Kingsley Amis, said, quick, write a Bond novel. Use somebody else's name. We don't care, but get it out there. So he wrote that book, and that launched the entire industry of post-Fleming Bond potboilers over the next 40 years. So you can thank Gulyashki for that. So the next attempt was an established Soviet journalist, Julian Semyonov, who had made his career as a Nazi hunter after the war, and whose personal adventures would be a whole other talk as well. He had written a number of novels about a Soviet agent in occupied Germany. And Andropov said, hey, write something about a Soviet agent on a Nazi party, high up in a hierarchy, during the war. And so Semyonov turns it out, and it was serialized in Komsomolskaya Pravda. And it was an issue of that magazine that the CIA got hold of, and because the story was presented as a series of dossiers, it looked similar enough to a documentary that this unknown CIA officer, who might be sitting in this room, who knows, looked at it, oh, wow, probably somebody BSing, but we better put it in the files just in case. So he was commissioned to write a TV miniscript series script because the serial was so acclaimed that everyone was calling for a film of it. So, a real A-list cast of beloved Russian character actors is put together to play not only Stirlitz, but all the Germans. Now, you wouldn't expect the Germans in a Soviet miniseries about the war to be some of the most charismatic, lovable people. It's a little bit like Tommy Lee Jones? No, who's the guy who's in The Fugitive, the antagonist? Tommy Lee Jones, thank you. He was like 49% as sympathetic as Harrison Ford because it was Tommy Lee Jones playing the character. It's kind of what went on with the character who played Mueller, the older gentleman up there. Another peculiarity of the cast was how many old people were in the cast. This is at a time when the Soviet Union was being run by a bunch of octogenarians who are taking turns being premier for 6 or 8 months and then having a heart attack. And that's one reason Gorbachev got his start, because let's get somebody who's reasonably young to take the role. But one scholar has said this was a deliberate bow to the vitality of the Soviet gerontocracy. Have all these old dudes in this cast. And in fact, Mueller, the historical Mueller, was 45. How old does that guy look to you? 65? Guess how old the actor was? 45. Yeah, I was surprised too. So deliberate attempt, let's make all these people old. And at a critical point in the plot, when Mueller is trying to deduce who the mole is, and he's getting nowhere with all his hot young detectives, he gets on the phone and he calls his old cronies from when he was a beat cop 40 years earlier, apparently. And now it's 3 old guys getting together, solving the crime, right? And that's the sort of plot twist. So that's a very interesting angle. The music became famous as well. You're going to hear the theme song and the famous waltz in various clips when we get into those. And they occupy the same place in the musical firmament as probably the Star Wars theme does in the West. Everybody knows it, knows them and loves them. So the show is a huge hit. It's like the Super Bowl. Crime rates plummeted on Tuesday nights or Monday nights. Literally, the water pressure on Moscow dropped to nothing because whenever at the break, they play the Internationale for the break, and everyone runs to the bathroom. And the hero, who he has several names. Presumably, his true name is Colonel Isayev. In cover, as a Nazi Colonel Max Otto von Stirlitz, became a permanent and beloved fixture immediately, both because of the character and the actor who played him. Known as Stirlitz. Hereafter, I'll just say Stirlitz. So it was rebroadcast every year, just like The Wizard of Oz, only for 12 nights in a row. And for 20 years, everything would stop on those nights. You don't go out on dates or anything. You stay home and you watch black and white, 17 Moments of Spring. So you've lasted with me this far. Thank you. I'll reward you by actually showing some of the dang show. All right.
Думай о секундах свысока. Наступит время, сам поймешь, наверное. Свистят они, как пули у виска. Мгновение, мгновение, мгновение. Мгновение, спрессованы в года. Мгновение, спрессованы в столетия, и я не понимаю иногда, где первое мгновение, где последнее. У каждого мгновенья свой резон, свои колокола, своя отметина. Мгновенья раздают, кому позор, кому бесславие, а кому бессмертие. Из крохотных мгновений соткан дождь, течет с небес вода обыкновенная, и ты порой почти полжизни ждешь, когда оно придет, твое мгновение. Придет оно большое, как глоток, глоток воды во время зноя летнего. А в общем, надо просто помнить долг. От первого мгновения до последнего. Не думай о секундах свысока. Наступит время, сам поймешь, наверное. Свистят они, как пули у виска. Мгновение, 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 мгновение.
Получив сегодня задание Центра, Штирлиц не мог знать, что 6 дней тому назад Сталин, ознакомившись с последними донесениями советских разведчиков, поздно ночью вызвал начальника разведки и сказал ему:
В явлении любых попыток соглашений фашистов с наиболее агрессивными империалистическими группировками Запада должны рассматриваться вами как задача номер один.
Понятно, товарищ Сталин.
Okay, so first of all, Stalin wasn't nearly that tall in real life. But also, so you have Stalin telling his intel chief to task Stirlitz in Berlin with his mission. The central plot point that I think I alluded to was what they call in the film Operation Sunrise Crossword, which is a nefarious plot by Allen Dulles to go to Bern and secretly meet with the Nazis to arrange a total surrender behind the Russians' back, cut the Russians out of the post-war distribution. The historical fact, there actually was an Operation Sunrise. Allen Dulles did go to Switzerland and meet with Karl Wolff, a Gestapo official. The topic of negotiation in the last days of the war was arranging surrender of German troops in Italy under the German commander there. That was the extent of it. So that part's historical. The series posits that the follow-on plot was to expand that surrender to the entire Western Front, which would have been against Soviet interests. Historically, Stalin was given advance notice and had no problem with it. In the film, the whole point is that the Russians don't know. Stirlitz alerts his bosses and then is assigned to scuttle the whole thing. I won't say most, many Russians of a certain age who saw this in the 70s took away from it because of the very realistic treatment, a total conviction that the Americans were out to screw Stalin and the Soviets. Now, there's some justice to that, how long we took opening up the Second Front and so on. But this particular plot in the film is pure fiction to the extent that we have the Americans trying to arrange a total separate peace. We'll see later what lessons a later Russian leader might have taken from the power of fiction to not quite make up a lie, but distort the truth or make it into something larger than it wasn't. Let's see. Okay, so one other plot element that we'll talk about a little bit later is that Stirlitz has a team of Russian agents working for him, a radio operator known as a pianist named Kat, and her husband. Due to an unexpected Allied bombing raid, the husband is killed, and Kat, about to give birth, is rushed to a German hospital, where Stirlitz is worried that in childbirth she'll blurt something out that will give away her Russian affiliation. You know how this goes, I think. And spoiler alert, the film came out in 73, you had your chance, here come spoilers. The Gestapo rounds her up, and now Sturlitz, who's posing as a Gestapo colonel in deep cover, has to extract his spy, not only because he's loyal to his subordinate, but also because she can give away the whole game. But he has to do it without compromising his own character. And that leads to a lot of cat and mousing as Mueller suspects, the Gestapo chief, suspects that something's going on, and slowly the walls close in, almost literally, on Sturlitz. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about Mueller, the old gentleman who's really a young guy dressed up like an old guy. He's the most charismatic villain by far. The villain you love to hate. Even when they're talking in a torture room, you're still, oh, he's such a great. It's like it's as if Robin Williams had played him, right? He can't really work up a good hate because you know it's Robin Williams, and we love Robin Williams. So I'm going to show two conversations: one where they're good friends and kind of jousting, and another where things get a little bit more serious for Sturlitz. And we'll hear some of these self-important voiceovers that later Soviets have made so much fun of in retrospect.
Хай, Гитлер.
Доброе утро. Я, честно говоря, не ждал вас так рано.
А я боялся получить взбучку за опоздание.
Все вы боитесь получить взбучку от старика Мюллера. А я хоть раз в жизни кому-нибудь давал взбучку, а? Я старый добрый человек, про которого распускают слухи. Ваш красавец-шеф злее меня в 1000 раз. Просто он научился в своих университетах улыбаться и говорить по-французски. А я вот до сих пор не знаю, как полагается, резать яблоко или его надо есть, как едят у меня дома, целиком. Вот, с косточкой. Пошли. Я вам сюрприз приготовил. Прошу. Мы обнаружили на чемодане, в котором русская радистка хранила свое хозяйство. И вот на этот вопрос вам будет ответить труднее всего.
Почему? На этот вопрос мне как раз нетрудно ответить. Чемодан радистки я осматривал в кабинете у Рольфа. Вызовите его. Он подтвердит.
Он уже подтвердил это.
Ну так в чем же дело?
А дело в том, что ваши пальчики были зафиксированы районным отделением гестапо еще до того, как чемодан попал к нам.
Ошибка исключена?
Исключена.
А случайность?
Возможно. Только доказательная случайность. Почему среди 20 миллионов чемоданов, находившихся в берлинских домах, именно на том, где русская пианистка хранила свою рацию, обнаружены ваши пальчики? Как это объяснить?
Это объяснить действительно очень трудно. Или почти невозможно. Я бы на вашем месте не поверил ни одному моему объяснению. Я понимаю вас, группенфюрер. Я вас отлично понимаю.
Мне бы очень хотелось получить от вас доказательный ответ, Штирлиц. Даю вам честное слово, я отношусь к вам с симпатией.
Я верю вам.
Ну, ладно. Сейчас сюда придет Рольф, приведет русскую пианистку, и она поможет нам определить, я уверен в этом, где это вы могли наследить на чемодане, где хранилась рация.
Русская? Это та, которую я взял в госпитале. У меня абсолютная зрительная память. Если бы я ее встречал раньше, я бы помнил лицо. Нет. Она нам не поможет.
Она нам поможет. И еще нам поможет. Вот это.
Это была его шифровка, отправленная с Плейшнером в Берн.
Постарайтесь вспомнить, Штирлиц.
А вот это провал. Это крах. И наши ничего не будут знать. Я оказался идиотом.
Okay, spoiler, he does get out of it by thinking really hard and being very clever, and having done a good deed earlier in episode 1, comes back to help him much later. If you didn't know that Mueller was a dirty Nazi, you would love him, am I right? I mean, he's such a nice, likable guy. He doesn't want to hurt you, even though it leaves you in a torture room to think things over. And you see that throughout the entire series. Sympathetic Germans, not only common Germans, but even folks way up in the hierarchy. And this seems to be part of a KGB charm offensive for the East Germans, that Germans and Russians are one people, temporarily divided, first by evil Nazis and later by pernicious, mendacious Americans. But we're good, right? You Germans and Russians? So very few just genuinely evil German Nazis, and those that do come to a deserved end. One other aspect of this series that made it so popular, and this is something that perhaps KGB licensed, perhaps the director was too clever. You've got a Soviet audience watching the show about a sensitive, smart, charismatic Russian surrounded by people who are as smart and terrific as he is, but who happen to belong to another system and who would destroy him in a moment if he ever opened his secret thoughts. You can see how that would resonate with the Soviet intelligentsia. It's like a dog whistle to anybody with half a brain watching the show. And one of the things that elevated it far above the common run of pop boiler thrillers, that it worked on several levels. Now, whether the KGB licensed a certain amount of subversion to increase the bona fides with their viewers, no one's talking at this point, but it's been argued both ways. Let's see. Okay, the next we're going to see probably the most iconic and the slowest scene in the miniseries. I'm not going to show the whole thing. It's 6 minutes of a sequence wherein, in a flashback, Sturlitz is operating in Spain, still as a Nazi, and the NKVD smuggles his wife in all the way from Russia to sit across from him for a few minutes in a cafe just so they can see each other for a moment. But they can't speak, they can't acknowledge each other. All they can do is gaze longingly, and boy, do they ever. So I'll play about 2 or 3 minutes of the entire sequence, and then we'll talk about that for a second. Then we'll see one of countless parodies of that scene, because it's like the characters of The Wizard of Oz. Any Western viewer instantly recognizes an allusion to that movie, and that's how it is with 17 Moments. And it has the other famous piece of music from the film.
Коньяк, сигареты.
Clearly in the script, it's the benevolent NKVD throws Sturlitz a bone, brings his wife in at great risk and expense so they can gaze at each other. But then the director or the casting director has a fairly thuggish-looking dude escort her in, be very protective, and keep an eye on her from across the bar. So is it Sturlitz, we're on your side, or is it Sturlitz, don't go native, we still got your wife? You can sort of see it both ways. And again, hard to know, KGB's, there are very few dummies running propaganda operations in the KGB. But I think it's plausible that this is something that the director inserted, a subtext that wasn't necessarily in the script. I noticed also that now that you've seen what his wife looks like, Sturlitz has a type. Just about every woman in the show, in the series, is a certain type of short-haired blonde like that. But he never misbehaves, never even comes close. Now Bond, you stop moving for a minute and Bond's all over you. Sturlitz is just totally honorable. But he's constantly reminded of his wife throughout the show. And I'll show you one of many parodies. I don't know how many of you recall Anna Chapman. She was the most glamorous of the Russian illegals who were caught in this country a few years back. They're all arrested, jailed, and then swapped back to Russia for some of ours. Chapman was photogenic enough to end up in the cover of Maxim magazine, and she's carved out a career in Russia as basically a Russian Kardashian, sort of, famous for being famous kind of person. And here, any Russian would recognize this in the first 2 seconds, and now so will you. This is a fairly short clip. This is New Year's Eve, Russian television.
Анна Чапман и Максим Исаев не виделись много лет, потому что в Америке никогда не показывают 17 мгновений весны.
I'll translate in a moment.
Об этом Первый канал устроил им встречу на Новый год. Сигналом Максиму Исаеву для выхода на связь стала ее фотография на обложке журнала, названного его именем. «Бедная девочка», — подумал Штирлиц, ведь она так давно не отмечала Новый год в России. Она даже не помнит, как это делается.
The translation is to the effect of, they hadn't seen each other for many years because in America they do not show 17 Moments of Spring. And the rest of it is, there's a joke to the effect that Max Sturlitz recognized her from the magazine that bore his name, because she'd been a cover girl for Maxim, and therefore the Russian channel had arranged this meeting. All you better Russian linguists than me, speakers, fair enough? Okay. And there are a lot of, even Anna Chapman has at least one other parody online of the same bit. Those of you who remember your Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol will recall that at the end of that movie, Tom Cruise, his character, is granted the chance to gaze longingly at his wife from across the plaza while a guy escorts the wife into a cafe, and they can look meaningfully but cannot speak. That's a direct lift, ladies and gentlemen, from this scene. So Brad Bird, the director, is a true scholar of thrillers. Let's see. So I'm going to finally I'll show a scene with some actual nervous tension in it. Near the end of the show, Sturlitz has extracted Kat, the radio operator, the pianist, from Gestapo custody. He's trying to get them both into Switzerland on forged passports. She has her own baby in tow and also a German baby from a German soldier who saved her life and then was killed. There's another subtext there, Russian-German baby, which is which. They're comrades together in the back seat. And I love this scene because in a situation where James Bond would karate chop or ejector seat his way out of trouble, Sturlitz just uses human nature. I wore cufflinks tonight in honor of this scene. You'll see why in a minute. Sturlitz just knows human nature. He sees when his operator is about to lose her composure, and he calms her down just by giving her something to do. And it really illustrates his whole approach to espionage.
Штирлиц гнал машину к границе, имея в кармане 2 паспорта. На себя и свою жену, фрау Ингрид фон Кирштейн. Пограничный пункт.
Фон Кирштейн, прошу.
Ингрид, помоги.
Дистель, ты что, не слышишь? Узнай, в чем дело.
Погранзастава. Контрольный пункт слушает.
Я прошу, хоть ненадолго.
But it does show the sort of the benevolent puppet master of all around him. So Stirlitz, that's my last clip from the film. I've got one brief clip that will make it obvious, I hope, why this is relevant to the modern day. I mentioned before that Stirlitz is often called inaccurately the Russian James Bond, but Atticus Finch is a better analog. And I'm going to talk for a minute about anecdote. Russians love their anecdotes. They're short, biting jokes that kind of cream up during the Cold War era, the Soviet era. And Stirlitz has his own subgenre of jokes. There's hundreds of them, and they usually focus on the sometimes pompous or obvious voiceovers that you see. This is a typical Stirlitz joke is Stirlitz walked through the streets of Berlin dragging his parachute and singing the International in Russian at the top of his voice. Never before had he been so close to failure. Right? Or one other, a flower pot fell from the window ledge and smashed Stirlitz on the head. This was a secret signal from Moscow that his wife had just given birth to a son. Stirlitz shed a single manly tear. He hadn't been home in 7 years. And then the relationship between he and Muller comes in for a lot of anecdote as well. So the genuine love and nostalgia people have for the character in the series doesn't preclude, a lot of what the British would call extracting the urine from the whole enterprise. So 1973, Vladimir Putin is 21. Here's why it all matters for us today. Besides the fact that it's an excellent show, well worth watching. Putin has said several times that 17 Moments of Spring was what inspired him as a college student to join the KGB. That he was amazed that one person could do what a whole battalion could not. And remember, this is presented as very much a historical drama where the stuff in it actually happened. That even if there was no Stirlitz, that this whole mendacious scheme of the Americans was historical fact. And that sank into Putin's memory like everybody else's, one assumes. The timing's a bit ironic too. 1973 is the year this film comes out, and almost single-filmedly, converts the image of Russian espionage from the seedy, murderous business to this cool, glamorous thing to do. 1973 was the worst year for American intelligence. We had the Church Committee gearing up to expose IC wrongdoings to the Cold War. You had the Pentagon Papers, the CIA family jewels. Our reputation for the intelligence just went straight to the crapper for the next 20 years. Right? Who's the villain in every American thriller of the 70s and 80s? Rogue CIA officers, or just the agency. The one main villain in MASH was Colonel Flagg, the intelligence officer. Right? That was sort of our popular image. Whereas in Russia, you simultaneously have the Americans, here left to right, American intel goes down, Russian intel goes up at 1973. So Putin does his 20 in the KGB, and he gets out in 1992, and he gets a job in the St. Petersburg city government. He almost immediately persuades a well-known Russian filmmaker to shoot a documentary about the city government of St. Petersburg. And he has himself filmed in a way that you'll see in a moment. Now, the original documentary, as far as I can tell, is totally scrubbed from the internet. And I have to believe it's by design. There's 100 links to it from various articles, all dead links from both English and Russian language searches. But this piece of it survives, about 40 seconds from a PBS documentary. So our final clip here.
Even as his star rose, there was an early example of his ambition. He commissioned a documentary about himself. It was called Power, made by Igor Shadkan.
Но у Путина была определенная цель.
Putin had an agenda. He wanted to admit that he had been a KGB agent in foreign reconnaissance.
Но он занимался внешней разведкой.
После окончания университета мне было предложено прийти на работу в органы Комитета государственной безопасности.
For Putin, it was an effective way to out himself as a former member of the reviled KGB.
Okay, so in 1992, he just didn't go around bragging about being in the KGB. Now, he had been in foreign intelligence, which was less tainted than domestic security. Even so, it was a fairly bold move. We can see from that footage, seeing what we've seen, and knowing that the 17 Moments music had been used in the original documentary, this is totally a move to wrap himself in the flag of Stirlitz. Just like Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Predator or the Terminator, or Ronald Reagan and all the cowboy movies, he rode this persona of the quiet, unflappable spy through the chaotic years of the 1990s, all the way to national power. And the media constantly called him Stirlitz. It became shorthand for Putin, was Stirlitz. This photo is from Vlast magazine, no connection. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll leave it at that. For about a week before the first election that he won, and it says President 2000 Portrait of the Future Head of State. Right, and it's about Putin, but Stirlitz. So the whole point of this little presentation has been to draw a line from initial Russian cultural rejection of espionage as a worthy topic of entertainment to the rehabilitation of the profession. Through a KGB-financed, but still fairly subversive story about an NKVD officer, nowadays KGB. So then we have a young Russian KGB officer inspired by this show to join the agency, and who later assumes a persona of that same hero to launch his own career. I think it's safe to say that Putin did not forget how the series mixed historical fact and fiction to implant the lasting false impression of American mendacity in the Russian memory. An impression almost invisible to this day to almost everyone in this room, because here in America, we do not show 17 Moments of Spring. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Eric. That was lovely. I think we all know what we'll be doing the next long weekend. We have something excellent to be binge watching. I think you said 16 hours, so thank you. I'm going to be talking about The Plainclothesman, but before I get started, I first would like to thank my colleague, there he is, Anatoly Gorbanov, for his insight into Soviet culture during the 1970s, and also for some help with some Russian translations. So Anatoly, thank you so much. He's in the back. If I mispronounce anything, it's all his fault. Go straight to him. The Plainclothesman. It was released in December 1973. So this is just a few months after 17 Moments of Spring. Show of hands, has anyone seen The Plainclothesmen? Amanda in the back. Great. All right. Well, so this is going to be a treat. So this is not nearly as iconic or well-known as 17 Moments of Spring, but it's going to be a completely different experience. I'm going to show the first clip here. It's the first 2 minutes, and you're going to see how it's so different from the 17 Moments of Spring.
Стой! Стрелять буду! Ко мне! Вперед! От века ты не уйдешь.
Отстреливайся. Скоро перекресток.
So we are less than 2 minutes into this movie, and we've got a car chase, we have a gunfight, and we've even got a fight with a Nazi. So much has already happened. You can see this already is a very different tone than 17 Moments of Spring. So the basics of The Plainclothesmen. It's set in Germany in 1936. The premise is Soviet intelligence officer Sergei has been sent to Germany to gather information about their political plans. And how does he do that? Well, first he pretends to be a Hungarian count. He ends up charming an SS officer enough that she will give him information about German rearmament. He also gains information about some of Hitler's political plans from an actual member of the German general staff. He does all of this and remains completely undetected by the Nazi officials. He's basically working right under their noses, but they don't catch him. Once his mission's complete, instead of just disappearing, he fakes his own death once it's all over. So, this all sounds, is this too far-fetched to be true? This sounds more like a Hollywood type of scene. This can't be real in any way. Well, Sergei is actually based on Dmitry Bistrolyotov, an actual Soviet intelligence officer in the 1920s and 30s. You can see they did a wonderful job casting there. Sergei looks pretty good if he's trying to be Bistrolyotov. And the Plainclothesmen is really, while heavily censored by the KGB, it's the start of Bistrolyotov telling his really incredible story. So throughout this presentation, I'll be referring to Sergei when I'm talking about The Plainclothesmen, the film, and then I'll also be referring to Bistrolyotov when I'm talking about the real-life events that this is all based on. So who was Dmitry Bistrolyotov? He was a Soviet intelligence officer in the 1920s and 30s. He was sent on missions all over the world. He worked primarily in Europe, but he was also sent to South Africa and even Africa. And for most of his career, he is operating without official cover. What does that mean? It means that he's basically on his own. The Soviet government is not there to help him. If he were to be arrested or caught, the Soviet government is not going to own him. He's on his own. So he's subject to that country's laws. He could be arrested and imprisoned or even executed. So it is incredibly dangerous work that he's doing. And he's really kind of designed for it. He is fluent in over a dozen languages. He's excellent at blending in. He comes up with these covers, and he really knows every detail of them. And so he is working and doing this. But after over 10 years, you know, this is very taxing on his life. He would like to retire. He would like to draw and paint. He's an artist. That's what he'd really like to do, and he'd like to write. And so, unfortunately for Bistrolyotov, though, that does not happen. Instead, he is arrested in 1938. And as Eric mentioned earlier, he is one of those people who gets swept up in Stalin's political purges. Between 1936 and 1938, there's this period of great political repression where perceived political rivals are either killed or sent to forced labor camps. And Bisholyotov gets caught up in this. Many intelligence officers were included in this roundup. Nearly all of Bisholyotov's colleagues end up being executed or imprisoned during this time. So he ends up being imprisoned. He gets sentenced to 20 years in one of these forced labor camps, Gulag, and then also 5 years of deprivation of civil rights. And while he is imprisoned, he uses some of those same skills that he used as an intelligence officer. He is able to acquire paper and writing utensils, and he starts secretly recording what is happening in these camps. He starts recording these memoirs. And during his career, he is completely gung-ho in what he is fighting for. He totally believes in the communist cause. He believes in Stalin. He believes in everything. But after being in these prison camps, he slowly starts changing his mind. He starts becoming disillusioned with what's happening. He's realizing most of these people who are in these camps are innocent like he is and have just been rounded up. So he starts writing down these experiences. And he miraculously ends up surviving. There's little food, freezing temperatures, poor shelter, many people die. But he ends up surviving, and he ends up being released in 1954. So this is after he served 16 years in the Gulag. He's released early because of poor health. While he had been imprisoned, he had suffered multiple beatings, broken ribs, nerve damage, paralysis. He even spent 3 years in solitary confinement. So he is released. And once he's released and once he regains his health, his primary mission really becomes finishing these camp memoirs. That is his goal. He needs to share this experience and share the experience of those who didn't survive and make it out of there. That becomes his goal. So he spends 4 years writing his memoirs, submits them to the Union of Soviet Writers. They rejected them. And Bisholyotov is shocked by this, which might seem unusual to us. He's been living in the Gulag. Doesn't he realize the type of country he's in? He didn't realize how repressive it really was. He can realize that there's really only one publisher, that's the state, and they did not approve of what he's talking about in these memoirs. So they're rejected. But instead of giving up, he tries a different angle. Instead, he focuses on his career as an intelligence officer. So he submits that. And that actually gets the attention of the KGB. And so now they're interested. And so they bring him in, they talk to him, they want to make sure that this is a real person, find out what his story was. And so they end up actually giving him approval and giving him the go-ahead to actually write a screenplay about his experiences as an intelligence officer. So that's what he does. And he writes Generous Hearts. And that was one of the artifacts in the back there with Lucy. We have that copy that he wrote. So he writes Generous Hearts, submits it. That then gets rejected. The KGB censors look at it and say, Soviet intelligence officers, they don't work like this. You can't say that they are bribing people or seducing assets. You can't say that. And he's like, but that's what we did. He's like, no, that doesn't matter. You cannot say that. So he goes back and sanitizes that screenplay. He decides he'd at least like to have at least some of his story told instead of none of it. So he sanitizes that screenplay and then submits the plain clothes men, which is what we have today. And Bisholyotov was very involved in this film. The KGB had consultants to help with production, but they were not particularly knowledgeable about the operations of the 1920s and 30s. So Bisholyotov really gets to be that expert and talk about what was happening. He helps in costume design, he helps in directing, he even gets to have some influence in the casting. And as you can see, he really wanted to have actors and actresses who looked like the real people that he is depicting in this story. So he also had actors and actresses who, some of them were actually quite famous Soviet film stars at the time. He wanted, for example, the gentleman in the center, Kempner, there. He really wanted this blonde gentleman to be playing this character because he envisioned him as this British agent he had worked who was blonde and drunk a lot. So he makes this character, he wants him to be blonde, kind of look like him, and drunk a lot. Even though in the movie he's not one of his assets, he's actually the officer trying to catch him, but he still wanted him to look like that. The one character that he was not very pleased with the casting is Doris. She's in the bottom right there. That is the SS officer that he seduces. In real life, in Bishuliov's story, Doris is supposed to be this considered very unattractive woman that he is supposed to charm and seduce. And he, of course, is this very handsome, very charming man. And he has to figure out a way to make it believable that he is interested in her romantically. So he comes up with this whole plan. It works. But in the casting of this, he wanted a woman who would not be very attractive to him. And so he felt like the audience doesn't understand, the struggles he went through who is cast but a quite beautiful and attractive woman. So he felt like you don't understand quite the struggles he is. So that was his one of the casting that he was not very pleased with. And like I said, there were a number of well-known Soviet film stars. The Baron, who's played by Nikolai Gritsenko, he actually is a Nazi general in 17 Moments of Spring. And so he's also in this film here as a German baron who is part of an opposition group to the Nazis. So this is the cast of characters that Bishuliov is very involved in trying to make sure they tell his story in the most accurate way possible, despite the KGB's influence. So this movie is really a snapshot of his career. It takes lots of operations that he's done and kind of puts them all together, cuts them up, and puts it in this film. And his goal is to create really as accurate an image as possible of what the career of an intelligence officer looks like. He felt like lots of what was depicted in TV and movies beforehand was just not accurate. It wasn't showing what a real intelligence officer does. So he draws on his actual experience. So the cover that Sergei in the film uses is one of Bishuliov's actual covers. It's the Hungarian Count Pirelli de Carahaza. And a number of times in the film, the characters can't pronounce that name. It is a struggle to get through. So it's kind of fun to see that. And he also talks about some of the trade crafts that intelligence officers would use. He, in this movie, kind of shows him having signals with the agents he's meeting with. He'll meet them in restaurants and cafes, like he actually did. And another thing he shows is that the intelligence officer isn't there working all by himself. There are other people there that he's working with. He's working with a team. And so this next clip is going to show that he has other people there assisting him. In this next clip, the Nazi officer that he scuffles with in that very first clip has spotted Sergei in Berlin. And so Sergei needs to try to lose him. And so you'll see that he has a little help.
Что с тобой?
Я узнал его. Это тот, который ушел от меня в трактире «Утренняя роса».
Это навязчивая идея, ты уже в 10-й раз. Рихард, остановись, Рихард! Папа! Назад!
All right, so that shows not on his own. He has a team. He's working with other people who's supporting him. Now, Bisholyotov, he was well equipped to be an intelligence officer. He was incredibly handsome, well educated. He was actually raised as an aristocrat, so he knew the manners of high society. He could blend in, and he was also incredibly charming. This gave him some advantages. He was very good with the ladies. And he took advantage of that. He seduced a number of embassy typists, cipher clerks, a British Foreign Service officer's wife, and then even that SS officer I mentioned earlier, Doris. So he used his seductive charm to his advantage in gathering intelligence and information for the Soviet Union. So let's go ahead and see all of Sergei's most seductive scenes in this film, all put together. So, despite Marvin Gaye's words, there's actually no getting it on in this film at all. Not even a suggestion of it. While Sergei is clearly very handsome and charming, he never resorts to physical seduction. This was one of those points that the KGB censors really cared about. This was one of the things they wanted cut out of Bishulyotov's script. This is one of those things that, no, they don't do this. They're not, seducing and sleeping with women. Of course not. This is, of course, drastically different than what Bishulyotov's actual career was like. He was, in fact, married to Maria Milena Yolanta Shamatova, and he seduced many women while being married. And on their actual wedding night, he spent it with another woman, a French embassy typist who had access to diplomatic codes. So this is completely different than what's being portrayed in this film here. And we can see this again in this next clip where Sergei is given this photo of his wife and child. This is a moment where he gets it's not quite as poignant as Stirlitz's 6-minute gaze with his wife, but this is again showing, they're benevolent. Here you go. Here's this photo of your wife and child, and he gets to look at that, and it's kind of a reminder of what he is doing. Of course, it has to be burned. He can't, if he's this Hungarian count who's single, he can't be having a photo of this wife and child. So unlike Bishulyotov, Sergei gets to remain faithful to his wife, similar to Stirlitz in 17 Moments of Spring, where he is faithful to his wife. And so we might be wondering, if there's no real seduction in this film, how is he convincing this SS officer, Doris, to give him the information that he wants? Well, he still charms her. And he ends up appealing to her fanatical devotion to the Nazi Party. So instead of pursuing her romantically or in this more traditional sense, he tries to appeal to her mind. And so he approaches her as this Hungarian count who knows nothing about Nazi politics. Who's this Hitler, this Göring, this Goebbels? All their names sound the same. And she gets very upset. She is so fanatically loyal. She starts talking to him and telling him about the wonders of the Nazi Party. And he becomes her very diligent student, and he is eager to learn all of this. So she starts teaching him. And while she's teaching him, she starts to turn some of that passion towards her count. And so Sergei starts to see this. And he also starts to find out that Doris has some high aspirations. She would perhaps like to be a countess. She would like to raise her station a little bit. So she does start genuinely falling for Sergei. But while he's a Hungarian count, he's impoverished. He doesn't have much money. So he talks with Doris and says, we could get married, but I would need more money. And how can I get more money? Well, I have this great idea. What if we play the stock market? You have all this secret information about Germany's plans for what military goods and weapons they're going to buy. What if we use that information and buy the stocks of those companies early while they're low? And then when the German government buys it, they'll go up, and then we can exchange that and we'll make all this money. It's a great plan. Doris is a little skeptical, but Sergei says, I have this guy, he can help us out, he knows the stock market really well. And she, wanting to be a countess, starting to fall for Sergei, she agrees. And so she gives him the information that he asks for. While this sounds far-fetched and a bit ridiculous, this is how Bish-Lyotov ends up getting the information from the SS officer. He actually proposes marriage to her and says, I want to marry you, but I just can't. We need the money. And she's very skeptical. She makes him go through lots of steps and processes to verify that the stock market guy he has is legit, and he does. So she gives him the information. Now he's gotten the information he's needed. He's completed some other missions in Berlin. What happens next? Is he just going to disappear? He's not. He's not just going to disappear. Doris would get suspicious. She might start looking into who's this Hungarian count. Instead, he fakes his own death. And he has the contact that he had been working with the stock market deliver Doris this newspaper. And in the newspaper is a clipping that talks about how this Hungarian count died in a car accident while he was home in Hungary. And Doris totally believes this. She believes to the end that he is this Hungarian count. And this is what Bish-Lyotov, in the real story, actually did. He faked his own death. But in that scenario, instead of dying in a car accident, he dies in a freak hunting accident while he's in Hungary. And so once he has completed these missions, he's faked his death, he is now on to his next mission in Spain. And so the next clip we have here is Sergei.
Господин барон Joachim Eitel von Ostenfelsen.
Да-да. Прошу вас. Благодарю.
Makes it out, no problem. A little less tension in that passport scene than in Stierlitz's passport scene. He just cruises right on through there. Meanwhile, the Nazis are left trying to figure out what happened exactly. And that's kind of how the film ends. It's different than his real life, of course. He ends up being imprisoned. And so this kind of instead shows more of a happier ending. But there's one more clip I want to show, and this is kind of one of my favorites. It's at the very beginning of the film, and this is where Bish-Lyotov actually makes a cameo appearance in the film. And this is when Sergei is being given his Doctor of Laws degree.
Господин граф Андор Перинги де Кирилигаза. Господин граф,
Мы поздравляем вас с высоким званием доктора прав и надеемся, что вы будете помогать нуждающимся людям.
So he congratulates Sergei on his degree in law and then hopes that he will help people in need. And so while this film, The Plainclothesman, only told a part of Bishlyotov's story and a KGB censor wrote that, it opened the doors for some of his writing to be published. Unfortunately, Bishlyotov dies just 2 years later in 1975 from heart failure, but his memoirs survived and his story is shared. And while The Plainclothesman is far from the complete and accurate picture of his life, it does offer a glimpse into the career of a really remarkable and quite complicated man. And we did have the memoirs are also in the back if you didn't get a chance to see them. But thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed tonight. We will do some questions. We just ask that you wait for the mic. Amanda's got a mic, so if you have any questions for myself or for Mr. Jens, please let us know.
Any questions? Oh, all right.
We got a mic right there. That one is.
I have a question for Ms. Altmans. So you had mentioned earlier about the first show that people would wait by their TVs to watch it every single week. So how is it with movies? Was it widely viewed by everybody? Did a lot of people go to the movies or cinema?
So this film was not nearly as popular as 17 Moments of Spring, where it really was the world stopped when that aired. This, when it first was released, wasn't particularly popular, but the following year it ended up having, I believe in the records I found, 26 million views that following year. So it's not nearly as popular as 17 Moments of Spring, but what can be? Really, that's so iconic.
Eric, do they still show 17 Moments of Spring?
They showed it every year until the early 90s. I don't think it's really the event that it was because we have cable and I don't know, maybe somebody else has a different perspective. It's still well known, but I think most people who are going to see it have already seen it.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. What years was Bistrolyotov actually working in Nazi Germany? Because if he was imprisoned in 1938, I was kind of curious, when he had actually been there.
Yeah, so he's operational really kind of starting 1925 through 1937. And so when he is doing the operation specifically against this SS officer, that is, I believe that might be 1934. So this is all happening before World War II. So he's in prison before that, which, this film is set during this is set right before World War II as well. So that's when he was doing that.
You said that Andropov was head of the KGB and he had 17 Moments of Spring produced?
We have a Semi Chastney who was the KGB director in the mid-60s. He was only 37, very young for the job. And so he started a push to rehabilitate the agency, to start publicizing the stories of Russian spies like Richard Shorts and others, and tried to start creating a corps of spy heroes. And Andropov took that and ran with it when he got the job, and directly commissioned it to Semyonov and got the KGB to bankroll and help produce the TV show.
How did the publicity for it work? Do you know? The PR effort, was the KGB behind that? Do you know how that worked?
The promotion of it?
The promotion of the film.
I mean, I think it's well known that, actually, I'm not sure to what extent people understood the KGB was behind it. Part of the appeal was that it seemed like a fairly subversive film that actually showed a lot more tradecraft than was allowed to be shown here, for example, for some reason. Different team of KGB officers, perhaps. But it had the ring of authenticity. It was cynical enough to seem like it was like something real was being shown. Shirley himself was such an iconic character, more sympathetic than the dashing rascal here. I don't think people really picked up at the time on how much of a KGB push production it was. It was assumed that anything that was on Soviet television was approved by the state, but I don't think people saw it as particularly pushed by the agency. They would have tried to keep their public fingerprints off it to help the bona fides rebellions.
Yeah, were there any films made where people like Philby or whatnot would be heroes to the Soviets?
That's a good question. I seem to recall some Russian film about the Cambridge Five, but I just don't remember anything about it. One thing I'm curious about is the kinds. There are intelligence officers and there are assets and traders, and they have different bargaining power in terms of like who you swap for who when your spies get caught. KGB was totally, they would never have swapped anybody for Ames, Rick Ames, a CIA trader, because he was just a trader. They had no value for him. Cambridge Five, that's not really a question you asked her. I'd be surprised if there were no films, but it's something for another talk, I guess. I'll look it up.
Oh, so if we wanted to geek out about this, is there anywhere that we can watch these films or can get them here today, or is there memoirs that are published?
The Soviets no longer chasing copyright on most of these. So the entirety of 17 Moments is on YouTube. You can also get the DVD, but it's all for free with subtitles on YouTube.
And the Plainclothesman's a little trickier. It is on YouTube. You have to search for it by its Russian name. Best Link does not have, none of them really have English subtitles, but I found, or Anatoly showed me one link where you can kind of create English subtitles. They're not that great, but at least is a little something you can kind of get the general gist of it.
How long is the Plainclothesman?
It is 106 minutes.
A pleasure.
Yes.
My question is for Eric. Thank you so much. In the movie, as they crossed the border, I believe from Germany to Switzerland, there were the Russian infant and the German infant. Was that used to be a distraction at the border? The reason I'm mentioning, because at the famous exfiltration of the most significant Russian spy that was turned, the Residentura in London, who was tricked back to go to Russia, and then the British exfiltrated him through Finland. There was an infant that the British brought along in the car, and they had a diaper that conveniently the infant pooped, and, so to speak, and then there was dogs around the van that they were using, and that saved them. Threw off. So I was wondering if that was part of the plot.
Great trick. I suspect it wasn't, because part of a major plot line was that Kat has her baby. She is fleeing through the sewers of Berlin, helped by a German army private, substantially the disaffected common German screwed by his superiors in the Nazi party. And it's his child, rescued from an orphanage, that she's carrying. So it's so integral to the plot, they had to have the babies with them. And that suspicious, multi-chinned border guard was not moved at all by the fact that her baby in the back seat. So I suspect in this case, it's just that she had two babies. And if it's to symbolize anything, it was German and Russian infants together, as we should all be. But it's a great point, and I'll look it up myself.
Thank you both for an incredibly stimulating evening. We just hope you'll come back and see new programming at our new Spy Museum next fall.
Thank you.
Thank you.